I'm Allison Danger, and this is Deathinitely.
Do you remember where you left off?
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to count you back in.
Yep.
5, 4, 3, 2.
Welcome. Thank you for being here for this episode of Deathinitely, the show that takes death seriously so you don't have to. I'm your host, Allison Danger, your internet death daddy, your experienced pro with expirees, your savvy death sleuth that's on a quest to learn everything about death and pass that knowledge along to you in a fashionable yet reasonably wrapped present for your ears. Today's episode is the iconography of death. If you like what you hear on Deathinitely and want to know more, check out today's show notes for all the socials and info, citations and links, and other internet clutter you might be needing. Deathinitely is an independent show and is made possible by generous people like you. If you want to know all the things, living and dead things, please be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, or you can join our mint condition fresh out of the box Patreon. Trigger warning, Deathinitely is a show that talks about death. Although today's show doesn't talk specifically about traumatic or sudden death, death itself can be triggering for people, so please listen with care.
What do I say? I'm Jordan.
With me, as always, is producer and editor Jordan Middlebrook. Hi, Jordan.
Hi, Allison.
You ready to talk about some death icons today?
That's what I'm here for.
Iconography, symbolism.
What is the symbolism of death, Allison?
Symbolism.
The symbolism of death.
Why'd you say it? You put the emphasis on the bowl. Symbolism.
Well, because it's not symbolism. So
Symbolism.
Similes
Okay,
of
we're
death.
getting off track.
All right.
Humans are visual creatures. We love the speed and accuracy that our visual center allows us to take in information with. People who can't see must use their other senses like superheroes. They would have to listen and feel to take in that information. I pay much less attention to how people speak, their tones, their intonation, than a non-seeing person does, I would imagine. I've never been a non-seeing person. Maybe that's why I read every text message or email with this tone of just slight annoyance. Am I projecting, or am I assuming that I am just always mildly annoying to everyone?
Are you annoying? That's a question that you're asking to the person.
I don't want to ask you. I don't want to ask you.
Don't ask.
Don't answer.
Okay.
The iconography of death is an ever-changing, dynamic mass of religious influence, culture, and language. It mixes together to give this hodgepodge of things that in some settings are completely innocuous, but while in others, they mean death.
Death. Sorry.
All caps. Symbols of death or iconography that are interpreted as death are more than just a few, but these macabre icons mean more than just the simple thing they depict. Let me explain. Symbols are co-opted pictograms. They have moved from referencing the thing that they depict to this intangible idea or theme, like death. We add emotional weight or meaning to a word, and it gives us a new value. For all the math lovers out there, there's a really simple equation. So if you take a word or an icon of something and then add emotion to it, it gives you value. So a word plus emotion equals value. Or in the case of, let's say, an hourglass, it's just a timepiece. But if you add the fear of death, it gives you a value of mortality.
Interesting.
So it becomes an icon. An hourglass is a simple timepiece. We add things like fear, sadness, or anger to this object. Time's infinite, and all of a sudden, this constant movement of the sand through this hourglass, we are instinctively aware and egocentric about the idea that all of a sudden this applies to us. Oh my God, I'm not going to live forever. What a bummer. Side note, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud is an excellent read and discusses comics in a way that makes them endless and enjoyable, but it also delves into the depth that they hold by blending the sequential storytelling using images and words. It's told in a comic style, and it's an education on how our minds take in information. Great for visual learners, but also anyone who values the art and science of good storytelling. There's a particular section that discusses the importance of symbols and icons as part of human communication. The method to his madness is for communicating in comics, but it's based on good science and can apply to any study of symbols and icons. Ta-da! Symbology.
Time is an interesting factor when you relate it to humans, because what is the average death rate? Oh, the average mortality rate? Nope.
No.
What's the average
Lifespan?
What is the average
Yeah.
lifespan of what a person in Canada is? Is it like 80?
It's a good thing I know it, but it's 84
84?
on an average, yes, between
Okay.
men and women in Canada.
Because it's one of those things.
Tune in next week when Jordan steals all the facts that you'll get later.
I didn't steal it. It's amazing that you knew the fact. I didn't know.
Yeah, I researched it for something else very recently, so you're lucky that I knew it, so I didn't sound like a dink.
You know what we could have done though is I could have said 82, and then at the end of your episode, I could have said
asterisk. He meant 84, guys.
I meant please,
guys.
Yeah,
Kids.
Jordan doesn't pay attention. So Allison, we're talking about time, and we're talking about this really fun math equation that you created with.
I wouldn't say it's fun, but it's accurate.
Well, okay, so it's accurate. Well,
Yeah.
People that like things that are accurate, right?
The academics. We use symbols and icons in our communication all the time. Language is symbols and icons. Visual cues like a furrowed brow when we're speaking to somebody else help us discern what somebody's saying. So when we're communicating with simple icons, we don't have the furrowed brow to go along with what's being said. But we use pictograms like hieroglyphs in way back when, and more modernly things like emojis and memes. Again, written language is heavily visual.
Mm-hmm.
A really good example of that is the letter or number O. Again, context is everything. Is it a 0? Is it an O from English? Is it the Greek letter omega? Is it the O with the 2 dots above it called the umlaut that is used in different ways in English, German, Danish, French, Swedish, Icelandic, Finnish, Hungarian, Turkish, and there are more, but I can't breathe anymore. People need context to understand how or why a symbol is meant to be interpreted. As an English as a first language speaker, I unfortunately only know one language. As a reader or listener, I would assume that if a symbol is being presented, a letter O, it would be an O, not an umlaut or an omega, because context matters. So if I'm writing you something, you're going to assume that that icon means O.
And now, when you say that, is that because it is in the English language?
I'm an English speaker, so you would assume that I'm going to communicate to you in English.
Okay.
So you wouldn't assume that the O is something from another language.
Fair enough. Okay.
But again, context matters. So is it an O as in LMNOP, or is it an O as in 0? Death icons are not immune to this context infection. Death is rife with emotion, and as an emotional robot, I can say that even in the coldest and blackest hearts, death has an emotional impact, whether you want it to or not. We take this banal image and apply all of our fears and trepidations about death into it, and bingo bango, we have constructed a memento mori.
Now, Allison, I have to ask, what's a memento mori?
It's Latin for the quote, remember that you must die. It's an artistic or symbolic trope acting as a reminder of the inevitability of death, or quote unquote, remember death. It has roots in Christianity and is most often seen in architecture and artistic symbolisms from the Middle Age forward. But we'll get into that pretty deep. Side note, memento mori. It's actually Latin for remember that you must die. This practice involves contemplating your mortality through physical reminders, meditation, or affirmations with the aim of cultivating virtues like detachment and finding motivation to live life to the fullest every single day. Memento mori is represented through symbolic imagery, or the iconography of death, bringing you full circle, like skulls, hourglasses, wilting flowers, and other motifs that invoke the transience of life. Parts of what is now Europe inflicted a lot of its cultural influences on the world as they colonized places everywhere over centuries. Particularly, or most recently, Victorian England saw things like funeral gifts become very popular, and that transferred to North America. Even as shortly ago, we've always taken heed from that Victorian influence in areas like fashion, style, art, dress. Funeralization and death care were very young in North American countries. And Canada and the US were just adolescent and impressionable compared to the adult that was Victorian England. Because funeral gifts were all the rage for wealthy English families, it so too became the fashionable in society families and families of wealth in Canada and the US. Funeral gifts ranged in number and quantity depending on status of the deceased or your relationship with them. They were things like gloves or scarves, alcohol, or jewelry was very popular. These memento mori, or remember that you must die, would often drain the majority percentages of a wealthy person's fortune. Cost a lot to die. People think that funeral expenses are bad now. It would eat like 50 to 60% of a person's fortune when they died.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
In an effort to exude the most wealth and fashion, they had to be the best even in death. Some of the wildest memento mori were exhibited in ornate custom-made jewelry. It was created using things from the deceased, which it's not for everybody. Things as bland as a piece of the deceased's clothing could be incorporated into a piece of jewelry. It could be as odd as some of their hair, or as outlandish as using their teeth or bones.
Oh my goodness.
There are some really sketchy records. There's nothing academically or scholarly articles written on this, but there are some records that blood was actually used as well to either be a part of or be contained in a memento mori or funeral jewelry.
Are these like vampires?
They were not.
All right.
So they were rumored to exist, but there's nothing academically or scholarly proving that they did.
It's all hearsay.
Yes.
Funeral hearsay.
Yes.
All right.
The gossip. The hot goss, as the kids say.
The funeral goss.
The funeral goss. Aw, like Gosling? Like a baby goose?
Or, I was
Ryan
saying Ryan Gosling.
Yeah.
All right.
Maybe this is why modern death-forward clothing, or people that wear their death literally on their sleeve, lean more to the Victorian England style of clothing, style sensibilities. It was a time period that kept death in style, or kept style in death. Maybe that's why we get a lot of vampire lore depictions in media with them dressed in Victorian clothing. Think Interview with a Vampire. There were a lot of frilly shirts.
I think I was vindicated with the vampire talk.
Yeah, you definitely wear
I didn't
frilly
know
shirts. I'm just surmising. It's nothing that's provable, but there's a lot of frilly shirts.
I had no clue you were going to talk about vampires.
Lucky you.
I feel that's a score on the point board for me.
Vampires, or
No, the fact that I said vampires and then
and then it came back
and
around.
then like a little bit later
Yeah.
you're just like, by the way,
You searched it, yeah.
vampires.
Oh, you saw it coming a mile away.
So Allison, what is the most popular death icon?
Well, spoiler alert, it's the skull. Big surprise.
Oh, okay.
Death symbols or icons most often used to depict death or elicit a death response fall into 4 major categories. Those categories are animals, flowers, timepieces, and bones. The biggies in the animal group are bats, cats, crows, and vultures. Cursory information on why these animals have evolved into symbols of death are sketchy. But we do know that bats very often symbolize transformation. Again, are we leaning towards vampires? I don't know. But they have been known to symbolize transformation. Cats also are a part of this transformation, boat. They are bad omens, and it has been said through the Inquisitional years that black cats were actually witches transformed.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Poor little black kitties. So transformation is thematically in keeping with death, moving from living to dead, the dying part that we talked about. Transformation is thematically in keeping with death and transition from living to dead. The other animals that you could include in the death icon group are crows, ravens, or vultures. I didn't know that crows and ravens were so different. I thought it was just like they had 2 names. Ravens are actually way bigger, and they have this little plumage on their legs, and it looks like they're wearing tiny little breeches or pants, and it's so adorable. I just love them.
Look it up online.
Yeah, ravens have pants.
It's cute.
It's adorable. So they were always seen in historical context as messengers from another world, but they were also always around dead things. We've learned that they're what are called carrion eaters, so they eat dead flesh. So they would be found at scenes of death, dead animals, dead people. They were around dead in the wild. The second category that death icons come from are flowers. Usually those are flowers that would grow around cemeteries or places that deceased remains were placed. The big ones are chrysanthemums, the cypress tree, the red poppy, or the hyacinth. From a very young age are taught the Flanders Fields poem around the November 11th.
Remembrance Day. Yeah.
Thank you. Or Veterans Day if you're listening from the States. And the poppy is a really important part of that. So that's come from a more recent death icon that is in memoriam of the First World War. Each of these flowers has been given the meaning of mourning or symbolizes death, and that comes from all different cultures. It's a vast scale. Again, you can hang around the dead, you get labels as such, you become death adjacent.
I have a quick question.
Mhm.
I don't know if it's rude to ask.
Okay.
I know that
This ought to be good.
This is on the fly. This is not something that we rehearsed or I spoke about in any way.
I'm giving him a very wide eye.
I'm getting the look that says,
look.
Jordan,
Don't do it.
I'm going to do it.
I know he's going to do it.
So typically with flowers, we're talking about symbolizing death. Excuse me, symbols of death and iconography.
Mhm.
And you're in the flower section of this podcast.
Yep.
So people typically give flowers at funeral homes. No, I'm not talking about graveside, but you go to an open casket or a closed casket.
It's a
funeral.
very cultural specific.
Where I was going with my question is, could you potentially give someone a bird? Now,
Could you give somebody a death raven?
so it's only being associated with death, much like a flower is.
Because it's around the dead.
Yes, but it's all a matter of perspective.
I mean, I would love a baby death raven, but I don't think, generally speaking, anybody wants to have to deal with not only the passing of somebody in their family, but also learning bird care on the fly. That's a pun. On the fly.
You did it.
It's a bird.
So you took my stupid question and you made it funny. I apologize for interrupting your podcast, Allison.
I mean, you could give birds, but I wouldn't.
But it's all tradition, right? Flower is
Yes.
a tradition because it represents death.
It's a gift. It's something
in
you can
some
give
way.
someone to show that you're thinking about them.
When I die, I want ravens and crows
Oh
in
my
lieu
God.
of flowers.
I don't want any part of this.
All right. So, Allison, we talked about flowers.
Oh my God.
Now, I know there's a third category. What's that third category?
What we had talked about before is timepieces. So it's really any timepiece, but usually the death iconography is made up of an hourglass, very old grandfather style clocks, an ancient sundial. It's not usually like a wristwatch or an Apple Watch or anything like that, but they all have the same effect. It all points to the terribly obvious, that time marches on and it waits for no one. Side note, regionally or culturally specific symbols are present, like crosses or crucifixes for Christians and Catholics, or countries that have been historically influenced by Christianity, like the United States and Canada and North America. But they aren't universal across borders and cultures like the above mentioned items.
Again, Allison, I want to interrupt and ask a question. If
No.
I'm going to give someone flowers at a funeral, could I give them a grandfather clock?
That would be way better than the death raven.
Okay. What about a grandfather clock that will ding on the hour, like it'll do the big gong on every hour?
Is it going to be a bad joke? I'm so worried.
No, I was going to say, can we give them a raven as well to stand on top of it and be creepy as hell?
Edgar Allan Poe style.
Yeah.
Right.
It's all death. It's all death
Always.
adjacent, right?
Always.
All death adjacent. That was the third category. Is there anything else?
The fourth and final group of often copied but never matched are the items meaning death and their bones. The skull and crossbones, a skeleton, or the skeletal visage of the Grim Reaper. We're not going to get into personifications of death today. That's a whole other chapter. But bones. So after all of these things that have been colloquially assigned to the death iconography, we most recognize in North America the skull as the top spot on the playbill of death. And that goes back to our pesky word math. Word plus an emotion equals a value. The skull is a universal item. It's something that we all share as being uniquely human. It's distinct looking, offering itself well to being detailed or simplified when we depict it in ways that are not a picture. When we're drawing a skull, it's really easy to know what it is, even if it's a very rudimentary drawing. It still retains its look, and it's also something that none of us can live without. A human skull is made up of two main sections, and it only has one point of articulation, which is wild. The mandible or jawbone has a hanging, hinge joint for chewing. Even without the jaw, the skull is still majorly recognizable, even when compared to our nearest mammal relatives. I'm not talking about your weird uncle. I'm talking about chimps and bonobos, The human skull is still vastly different than these mammals, and we can tell that just by looking at them. We do have a shared ancestor, and even with that lineage, they're still so different to look at that you don't have to be an anthropologist to be able to know the difference. Side note, we share about 98.7, give or take, % of our DNA with bonobos and chimpanzees. Bonobos are like miniature chimpanzees. They're super cute. Our closest shared ancestor died about 6 million years ago, and each species has evolved uniquely since. We share about 60% of our DNA with bananas and about 99.9% with other humans. In evolutionary science, there is something called the LUCA, or the LUCA, which stands for the last universal common ancestor. That's the guy that evolutionary science believes was the single-celled organisms that all life on the planet evolved from over the past billions of years.
So Allison, being a close genetic relative of chimps and bonobos, their skull is slightly different, right?
Yeah, their jaw's more protruding, their eyes are bigger, their cranial cavity where the brain is kept is a little bit smaller, and their jaw and teeth are quite distinct looking in separation from a human.
So unfortunately, a hiker or a police, like an investigator, they could reasonably tell the difference at first glance?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
But it's not just the skull's hollow eyes or a set of first-class chompers that make it the granddaddy of death iconography. The skull's universality makes it relatable to all humans. We all have a skull. Yep. And since none of us can reasonably be alive without a skull or head, a desiccated human skull alone or in parts is synonymous with death.
Like the pirate ship, Skull and Crossbones, right?
Yeah, man.
Are you going to touch on it later in this episode?
No, I'm not going to get into the Skull and Crossbones,
Okay.
but piratey. Arr.
I be talking about pirates.
I be talking about a skull. Okay, we probably shouldn't do.
No pirate talk.
No pirate talk.
Okay.
Human consciousness is also generally regarded as brain-related. It used to be thought of to live in the liver and the heart, but now it is known that a person is who they are because of their brain. A lone skull involves often thoughts of death like any other appendage would not. A rogue hand or foot, although it's terrifying to find in the woods, as I would suspect, people can live without those parts. You can't live without your head. It really elicits the idea that somebody has died. The skull houses the brain. No brain, no person. No person, no life. Finally, it's a very fancy bone-brain case. And there's a psychological phenomenon known as, and I'm going to say it wrong, but we're going to listen, pareidolia. Side note, pareidolia is the psychological phenomenon of seeing meaning in innocuous objects, or the tendency to perceive familiar patterns or reason in random or ambiguous visual stimuli.
Yeah, pareidolia.
So I'm just going to read you this pull quote from something that I'm working on, but I think it kind of sums up everything really well, and there was no better way for me to say it, so I'm just going to do this little part. The skull is a lasting reminder. It is what remains when the all-important brain and face have long since been destroyed by decomposition and desiccation. When everything else is gone, the skull remains, and it remains to be the most recognized symbol of death. Ba-bam!
Bam is right.
Good, right?
You didn't even need to talk about the skull. You could have just said I'm
that.
Allison Danger.
And
this
listen
is
to this
definitely,
thing.
Here is this one quote about the skull. Thank you, good night.
Bye!
I think that's a perfect quote that really sums up what the skull is in regards to the iconography of death. It's really good. That's a good one, Allison. I really like that.
Kind of dovetails really nicely into something that we'll cover a little bit later, but my personal favorite personification of death is called the Dullahan. It's the old Irish folktale, and it's the creature that came to claim the dead, which is now more commonly known, or was the inspiration for the Headless Horseman in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He's missing his head, so he's missing his humanity. Did that make him thirst for souls, or was he looking for one that suited him better? If the skull or the brain is the seat of a consciousness, is that why he was as fearsome and unyielding when he was cleaving out the eyes of his onlookers and the barbaric harvest of the souls that he was sent to collect from the underworld? Was it just really cool imagery in the story to depict this cool harbinger of death with a flaming pumpkin for a head? Or was it more metaphorical?
Allison, at the beginning of this episode, you had a disclaimer about trigger warning and sensitivities. And then in that one section you just spoke about, you said, oh, it's the skull,
right,
and he's hollowing out eyeballs. And so anyway, I'm just going to throw up another disclaimer that it's too late. Allison just scared the crap out of you.
It's the Headless Horseman.
The Headless Horseman doesn't scoop out eyeballs.
The Doulahan does.
But you didn't give us a warning about the eyeball scooping.
I didn't say eyeball scooping. You're saying eyeball scooping.
I wrote down a note about what you just said. And, you're right. It wasn't. You're right. It was cleaving, Allison. You used the word cleaving out the eyes of onlookers and the barbaric harvest of the souls he was sent to collect.
I'm a wordsmith.
Trigger warning. Cleaving of eyeballs.
I thought people liked cleaves or cleavage.
Trigger warning.
Allison said cleavage.
We need to get two things on a t-shirt. A, Allison said cleavage. And B,
but not in relationship to something good.
Yes. Allison.
Yeah.
There's a lot of personifications of death. And I really hope that in other episodes we get to that.
We definitely will, but the Headless Horseman, the skull, the penultimate death icon, it was just too good to pass up, and he's just too cool to not talk about.
I agree.
And it brings together this great conversation about how important skulls are.
I agree.
One of the other things, too, we can look at is the practicality of what a skull means to death iconography and symbolism. There's an evolving science and art of facial recognition. We use it on our phones. We have this great ability to recognize each other's faces, but it's gone beyond that. And there's a really great law of averages, more math, yay, about a person's skull. So they're actually not all the exact same. They are not always visible to the naked eye, but every skull is unique and has different shapes and sizes in the parts of that skull. Everybody's a variant.
Like a Loki variant?
I knew you were going to say it.
Well, I mean, did we talk about Superman in this one? Nope, that was in the first episode. Yeah, we talked
Loki
about
variants.
So
you gotta show Marvel some love too.
Every episode we have.
Comic.
Maybe we'll make a comic
nerdness.
mention.
So there's the science behind using known marked points that forensic artists and sculptors and software use that is known information from studies, from gathering just tons and tons of information. And we can use that information to extrapolate these average sizes and shapes and definitions of a person's face, how the muscles worked and where they lay and their connection points. This method of reconstruction is used for identifying John and Jane Does in cold cases, and it was developed by the Grand Madre of facial reconstruction herself. She actually helped develop the math and made reconstruction a science, and her name was Betty Gatliff. The Smithsonian has a great article about her and her contributions to forensic work in this field, and it details a great portion of her work. And one of her most notable cases is she was asked to work on the reconstruction of beloved and gunned down President John F. Kennedy. And they asked her to do that to help determine the bullet's path and direction upon impact.
That Smithsonian article, Allison, I'll put up in the show notes. So if
it's really great. She's such an acclaimed person, and she got into it in a very roundabout way, but she became this really great person in the forensic science realm. If you want to learn more about the topic of the ultimate death icon, the skull, and its contributions to things like forensic and science, I'd suggest reading on the topic the two books by Dame Sue Black, All That Remains or Written in Bone. Her perspective and experience in the world of bringing meaning to unidentified human remains is unparalleled. She's quick-witted, highly intelligent, and it makes her books interesting and intriguing, but also a banger of a good read. She's quite funny.
You just suggested a great couple books to read, Allison. Are you reading anything right now?
I'm still working on To Be a Machine by Mark O'Connell. It's that nonfiction novel about transhumanism, or for those not familiar, it's the theories and pursuit of living forever and evolving as humans by way of computers, tech, and robotics.
One day I hope to be a robot.
But I'm also reading a comic called The Human Target, and it's the second trade, and it's about when a man's power is taking the hits that were meant for you.
Oh, dang.
That's not a legal tagline. It's just me being silly.
Okay.
What are you reading these days?
What am I reading? Well, that's a great question. Nothing as fancy as what you're reading, and it doesn't really pertain to...
Death iconography?
Death, yeah. I mean...
Have you read anything with death in it? Probably.
Have I read I read a comic book the other day, and I'm pretty sure someone died in that.
There you go.
But I guess, ultimately...
Everywhere, all the time.
Someone dies in something, right? It's not like a kid's... it's not a little golden book where, Thomas the Train is going up the hill and Percy dies.
Oh my God, that's a dark story.
I'm saying, as an adult...
Sir Topham Hatt grieves little Percy.
Lady Fanny Bottom. What's his wife's name?
I don't know, but it's Fanny Bottom now.
It's Fanny Bottom. Mrs. Hat. I don't remember.
Lady Hat. That's
Lady
what
Hat.
It is. Yes,
Okay.
it's Sir Topham Hat and Lady Hat.
Fancy Bottom.
Fancy Bottom gal.
What I'm reading.
Whatever.
But if anyone is interested, I host a show. By the Wayside.
He does host a show. He's not just a pretty face, ladies. He is on TV. Well, internet TV.
I guess you could call me a YouTuber, but it is what it is. I talk about comic books on there, so.
And if you haven't gleaned that from the past 2 episodes, we read a lot of comics in this house. But yeah, the show's called By the Wayside, and Jordan brings in lots of local talent and talks about all things comics.
I'll put a link in the show notes.
There you go.
I have control over all of the links. I'll plug my own work now. So, Allison, conclusion. What do you got for me?
We're bringing it all back. Death iconography and symbols are pretty vast, varied, sometimes vile, really. Super gross. But it turns out that the images and items that are now recognizable icons of death have a deep, emotionally filled reasons for being amongst this macabre group. Not so important is the icon of death, but why people have assigned meaning to these images and items. If I've missed your favorite death icon or symbol, head to the comments and share your favorite one.
Awesome.
You can find episodes of Deathinitely on Spotify or Patreon. Don't forget to subscribe or sign up so you can keep your earballs filled with death knowledge noise. Deathinitely wants to take death seriously, so you don't have to. Creating a safe and inclusive space that tackles the mundane, profound, and crazy parts of death that you don't feel like asking anywhere else. Listen, participate, comment, love, learn. I'm happy that you're here. The next episode of Deathinitely is going to talk about the death lexicon, death language. Speak good death words, so dial up that pod and tune in next time. Deathinitely is an independent show that is recorded on the ancestral homes of several Mississauga and Chippewas First Nations. We honor these Indigenous peoples, ancestors, and future generations on this land that we share with reverence and humility. I've been your host, Allison Danger. With me as always is editor and producer Jordan Middlebrook, with Sound Bay Music. Links to reading, research, materials, and citations can be found below in the show notes. I'm Allison Danger, and this is Deathinitely, the show that takes death seriously so you don't have to.
Cool. And that's a podcast.